This is our flip lesson on evolution. We are going to talk about evolution in a biological sense, so we're talking about living things. With biological evolution, this is the change in the genetic makeup of a species over generations. So when we talk about a species, we're not talking about one individual organism, we're talking about the entire species. And generations would be grandparents to parents to children, those different timelines of when things mature, reproduce, create offspring, that begins a new generation. Okay, when we think of evolution, we need to understand that this means change. All species change over time, that is a fact, but it's how these species have changed over a period of time that allows us to then call this the theory of evolution. Okay, so there's a few words we need to understand. One is speciation. All right, this is when two organisms divide into unique species due to evolution, all right, or due to the fact that they need to change over time. All right, and we know speciation occurs when we have two organisms that can no longer produce viable offspring or offspring that live. And two of the main types are geographical and genetic. When we look at geographic speciation, this is when land physically separates two species so they can't reproduce. The blue and gray wildebeest are perfect examples. These are now on separate continents, and so geographically speaking, they can no longer reproduce with each other because they aren't going to swim across an entire ocean. Genetic speciation is when genetics actually does not allow an organism to reproduce. For example, if we cross a horse with a donkey, we end up with something called a mule. Mules are sterile and they cannot reproduce. So genetically, we have separated those two species. There are certain mechanisms or things that drive evolution. The higher variation we get within an organism, the better chance it has of evolving successfully. Some examples might be mutations. These are genes that just change at random. Migration, things change location. And especially during mating season is going to give us a wide variety of options. And then crossing over, which takes place during the process of meiosis, where genes actually exchange material with different chromosomes. And so these three things allow organisms to have a better chance of survival. All right, there's also just selection. Nature decides what happens and what survives and makes it and what doesn't. Or it could be artificial. All right, man gets involved and sort of dictates what gets to move on and what doesn't. All right, when we talk about natural selection, it's survival of the fittest. All right, those things that are most well adapted to their environment are going to survive and pass on to generation, and those things have, could be around for millions of years. An example, tuskless elephants in Africa. Nature has, they have selectively adapted to their environment and been able to thrive in Africa for quite some time. Artificially, this is survival of the chosen. Okay, humans sort of get involved and select desirable traits. When we think about dog breeding, all right, they are only going to breed purebreds in order to get the best quality of genes from generation to generation. When we talk about evolution, we have to talk about two individuals, Darwin versus Lamarck, and these guys were really the brains behind the theory. All right, Lamarck believed that certain things have acquired traits, that over the course of your lifetime, you acquire these traits, and those traits are now yours, and once you have offspring, those offspring will then get those traits. For example, he thought that horses over a period of time would stretch their necks during their lifetime, which then their offspring would have these longer necks, which eventually led us to the giraffe. Another way to look at it, if I work out and get big muscles, that I acquire those traits, that when I have children, they in fact will have big muscles, which we know is not the case. So his theory is highly disputed. Darwin, on the other hand, did a lot of his work traveling on a boat called the HMS Beagle. And during this time, he made a ton of observations, specifically in the Galapagos Islands. And what he found is in tortoises and birds, even though the Galapagos Islands are part of one chain of islands, the creatures, especially the tortoises and the birds on those islands, had tons of variations even though they were part of the same species. He concluded that those organisms had to adapt to their environment. Survival of the fittest is his quote, in order to make it from generation to generation. And in finches, he noticed specifically their beak, and that certain finches had different beaks depending on where they lived and what they used them for. And so he says that these birds adapted to their environment in order to make that happen. Now, evidence of evolution, again, let's talk, when we think about it, when we think of evolution, it's how things adapt to their environment, this idea of survival of the fittest. But we have to look at why, if everything survives, why are there such great variations in organisms? So variations are just how different animals of the same species look. If you take a look at this picture of the giraffes, obviously they all physically look the same except their color. They have the variation of color. This is an adaptation that they have based on where they live. And so you're going to see, even in the human population, we have a wide range and a variety of characteristics in humans. We're all part of the same species, but we look different. Okay, so how do we know evolution has occurred? Fossil evidence. All right, we study fossils, preserved once living things, to see how organisms have evolved and changed. And we can look at a wide variety of fossils, from microscopic to impressions of things to things that are now stuck in stone. And so we really use fossil evidence for quite a bit of our study of evolution. Okay, so how do we know things have occurred? All right, we compare things living on Earth today to fossil evidence of things that we have found over the course of discovery. And so we look at this fossil on the left, all right, which is a fossil of an ancient fish, and we compare it to fish that we know today, and it looks an awful lot like the anglerfish that lives in the depths of the ocean. Other evidence of evolution is embryology. We look at how things evolve in the embryo or in early development. And so the picture on the left, that first embryo is of a fish, and you can see that it has gill slits and it also has a tail. It's being compared to the reptile embryo, which also has a tail and slits. And the other two pictures are of a bird and a human. And so through embryology, we can say that because they all contain a tail and gill slits, that they must have evolved from similar materials. Okay, same thing with a tortoise and a chick. Obviously two drastically different animals, but if we were to compare their embryology, they do look almost identical until something happens through development where they then take on the characteristics of the animal that you know. We can do comparative anatomy. All right, it's where we compare the anatomy of two different species with each other to see common characteristics. In the picture, we're comparing a baleen whale to a hummingbird, two drastically different animals, but they share a lot of common structures. Importantly, they share a hind limb. Now, we know hummingbirds have legs, and so they do have a hind limb, but whales don't. But they do have bones that mirror or are similar to those of the baleen whale. And so it's important to do comparative anatomy to see how certain organisms share structures that otherwise would not have happened if they did not evolve from common threads. We can look at homologous structures, which is where we compare body parts of similar organisms to see if they share the same function, or if is it an evolutionary change due to their environment. All right, some examples: the humerus bone in these animals. All right, every single one of them has a humerus bone. All right, in humans, it is the bone that connects your shoulder to your elbow, and we can find evidence of a humerus bone in a wide variety of animals, which helps support the idea that this bone has been around for evolutionary time and must have evolved with organisms as they evolved. Obviously, the whale humerus bone quite small compared to the human, but the same bone does exist in all of these organisms. Other things that we can look at, something called a vestigial structure. These are basically structures that serve no purpose or function in organisms today, but they are still there as part of our evolutionary history. For example, wisdom teeth in humans. We would have had these teeth as early humans or early man used for chewing food that would have been real tough to chew. We do have a tailbone. It's part of our pelvic bone that would have been in our embryology, but then through evolution and through change, that gene does not keep it going and grow. And then we have the appendix, which they think served a purpose of digesting more plant food or plant type things when we were early humans. The whale and the snake have evidence of hind legs. Obviously, we know neither of those organisms today have hind legs, but they do have bones that still show up in their skeletal structure that would insinuate that at one point they did have hind legs that served a purpose. But through evolutionary change and survival, though they evolved to no longer needing those legs, and therefore they don't exist fully today. Okay, other vestigial structures, if we look at these hind leg bones of a salamander versus a whale versus a boa constrictor, these pelvic and hip bones would have appeared in all of these at some point, but the salamander, through evolution, still uses theirs, whereas the whale and the boa constrictor do not.